The first thing the people of Red Hollow noticed about Elias Vane was that he never entered town by the main road. He came at dawn. Always alone. Always riding an old black horse with a white scar across its nose. And every time he arrived, the town fell silent. Children stopped playing in the dirt. Women pulled their curtains shut. Men resting outside the saloon reached instinctively for the pistols beneath their coats. Because everyone in Red Hollow knew the name Elias Vane. They said he had killed 12 men before he turned 30. Some claimed the number was closer to 20. Others whispered that the famous outlaw had once emptied an entire revolver into a group of bounty hunters and walked away without a scratch. But there was one story nobody told loudly. The story of a little girl named Clara. That story followed Elias wherever he went. And perhaps that was why, on the cold morning of October 1887, the most feared gunslinger in 3 counties rode into Red Hollow carrying something far more dangerous than a pistol. A hammer. Elias stopped his horse beside an empty patch of land at the edge of town. The ground was dry and cracked. A few weeds struggled through the dust. Behind him stood the small church, the blacksmith's shop, and a row of wooden buildings that looked as though one strong wind might carry them into Kansas. In front of him stood Reverend Samuel Cole. The old preacher stared at Elias for a long moment. "You actually came," Samuel said. Elias climbed down from his horse. "I said I would." Samuel looked at the hammer hanging from his belt. "And the gun?" Elias reached beneath his coat. For a second, Samuel expected to see steel. Instead, Elias pulled out a revolver. The same gun that had made his name famous. The same weapon that had ended lives in saloons, alleys, and lonely stretches of desert. Elias stared at it. Then he walked to the edge of the property. He dug a hole in the hard ground with his bare hands. Samuel watched silently as the outlaw placed the revolver inside. "You're really doing this?" the preacher asked. Elias covered the gun with dirt. "I've spent 20 years building a name." He pressed the soil down with his palm. "Now I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to destroy it." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Why a schoolhouse?" For the first time, Elias looked toward the empty field. His face changed. The hard expression disappeared. And beneath the beard and scars was something that looked almost like regret. "Because children deserve a place where they can learn what I never did." Samuel frowned. "What is that?" Elias looked at him. "How to become something better." That afternoon, Elias began cutting cedar. Nobody helped him. Not at first. He worked until his hands blistered. He carried every beam himself. By sunset, blood had soaked through the cloth wrapped around his palms. The townspeople watched from a distance. They didn't trust him. And Elias didn't blame them. 3 years earlier, he had been a wanted man. A killer. An outlaw. A ghost with a gun. But now, as darkness settled over Red Hollow, Elias Vane stood alone beneath the stars, staring at the foundation of the schoolhouse he had promised to build. Then he heard something behind him. A child's voice. "Are you really a murderer?" Elias turned. A little boy stood several feet away. His name was Tommy Cole. The preacher's youngest son. Elias slowly wiped the blood from his hands. "That's what they say." Tommy stepped closer. "Did you kill 12 men?" Elias looked toward the place where he had buried his revolver. "No." Tommy's eyes widened. "So they lied?" Elias shook his head. "They forgot one." The boy's smile vanished. Elias turned back toward the unfinished schoolhouse. And far beyond the town limits, on a ridge beneath the moonlight, 3 riders were watching him. They had been following Elias Vane for 6 days. And they had no intention of letting a schoolhouse erase the sins of the past. Because one of those riders carried a photograph. A photograph of a little girl named Clara. And on the back were 6 words that would soon bring Elias Vane's violent past crashing through the doors of his new schoolhouse. You still owe us a life. By the time winter arrived in Red Hollow, the schoolhouse had begun to look like something real. The walls stood straight. The cedar beams were strong. And a small wooden sign hung above the entrance. Red Hollow Schoolhouse. Elias Vane had carved the letters himself. Every morning before sunrise, he was there. He swept the floor. Fixed broken boards. Stacked firewood. And worked until his fingers could no longer close around the hammer. The children had started coming too. At first, they kept their distance. But children were different from adults. They didn't care about rumors. They cared about whether Elias could make a wooden horse. Whether he knew how to throw a rock across the creek. Whether he could tell a good story. Within weeks, the same man who had once been feared across the territory was surrounded by laughter. But Elias never laughed with them. Because every time the children ran through the schoolhouse door, he remembered another child. Clara. He remembered her blue dress. Her brown hair. And the sound of her mother's screaming. That memory had followed him for 22 years. And now, someone had come to remind him why. It happened one freezing afternoon. Elias was repairing a window when a gunshot echoed across Red Hollow. The children screamed. Their teacher, Miss Abigail Hart, immediately pushed them beneath their desks. Elias froze. Another shot cracked through the air. A bullet tore through the schoolhouse window and buried itself in the wall inches from his head. Silence followed. Elias slowly turned toward the window. 3 horses stood at the far end of town. 3 riders. The middleman wore a long black coat. A silver star hung from his neck. But Elias knew that star. And he knew the man wearing it. Jacob Rusk, Elias whispered. The name meant nothing to the children. But it meant everything to Elias. Rusk had once been the leader of the Black Creek Gang. The same gang Elias had ridden with when he was 17. The same gang responsible for the bloodiest robbery in Red Hollow's history. And the same night that had destroyed Clara's family. Elias stepped outside. Miss Hart grabbed his arm. Don't. He looked at her. They'll kill you. Elias glanced back at the children. No. His voice was quiet. They came here to make sure I don't get the chance to live. He walked into the street. Jacob Rusk smiled. Look at you, Elias. He glanced toward the schoolhouse. The devil building a church. Elias stopped. Leave. Rusk laughed. You bury your gun and think you're a different man? Elias said nothing. Rusk pulled a folded photograph from his coat. He threw it into the dirt. Elias looked down. His heart stopped. It was Clara. Older. But unmistakably her. The little girl he had thought was dead. Elias slowly picked up the photograph. His hands began to shake. Rusk leaned forward in his saddle. You were told she died that night. Elias stared at the picture. You're lying. Am I? Rusk smiled. Clara survived. Elias looked up. Where is she? Rusk's smile disappeared. You'll find out soon enough. Then he rode away. Elias stood frozen in the street. For 22 years, he had believed Clara's blood was on his hands. He had believed she was one of the innocent lives destroyed by the Black Creek Gang. But if she was alive, then why had nobody told him? That night, Elias returned to the schoolhouse. The children were gone. The lamps were extinguished. Only Miss Hart remained. She found him sitting alone at the teacher's desk. The photograph lay in front of him. Who is she? Abigail asked. Elias stared at the image. The reason I built this place. He finally told her everything. 22 years earlier, Elias had been 17. Young, angry, and desperate for money. Jacob Rusk had promised him a share of a robbery. Elias agreed. The target was a stagecoach carrying gold. But when the gang stopped the coach, Elias discovered something they hadn't told him. There were passengers inside. A family. A father. A mother. And their 7-year-old daughter. Clara. The robbery turned into murder. Elias remembered standing there with his gun. He remembered Rusk shouting. He remembered the girl's father falling into the dirt. And he remembered Clara looking directly at him. She had been terrified. But she hadn't cried. She had simply asked him one question. Are you going to kill me too? Elias had lowered his gun. And that single moment had changed everything. He secretly helped Clara escape into the darkness. But when he returned the next morning, Rusk told him the girl had been found dead. Elias believed him. Until now. Miss Hart stared at him. You saved her. Elias shook his head. I helped destroy her life. You were 17. I carried a gun. You were a child. Elias looked toward the empty desks. No. His voice cracked. I was old enough to know better. Outside, the wind began to howl. Then they heard a horse approaching. Slowly. Deliberately. Elias stood. The sound stopped outside the schoolhouse. A moment later, the door opened. A woman stepped inside. She wore a long gray coat. Her face was hidden beneath a wide hat. Elias reached for the empty space where his revolver used to hang. Then the woman lifted her head. And Elias Vane forgot how to breathe. She had Clara's eyes. The woman stared at him. You don't remember me, she said. Elias whispered her name. Clara. She stepped closer. I remember you. Elias couldn't move. Clara looked around the schoolhouse. At the desks. The books. The wooden walls. Then she looked back at the man who had spent 22 years trying to escape his past. You built this for me? Elias swallowed. I built it for children like you. Clara's expression hardened. No. She stepped closer. You built it because you couldn't live with what you did. Elias lowered his eyes. Clara reached into her coat. When her hand came out, she was holding a small piece of paper. She placed it on the desk. Elias unfolded it. His face turned pale. It was a list of names. 12 names. Every person Elias Vane had killed. At the bottom was one final name. Jacob Rusk. Clara looked directly into his eyes. Rusk isn't here to kill you. She turned toward the door. He's here to make you kill again. Then she walked into the darkness. And Elias realized the hardest part of redemption wasn't burying his gun. It was proving that he could live without picking it up again. By sunrise, Elias Vane had made his decision. He would not run. He would not take up his revolver. And he would not become the man Jacob Rusk wanted him to be. But Jacob Rusk had never been a man who accepted defeat. 3 days later, Red Hollow woke to the sound of horses. Dozens of them. Men came riding through the streets with rifles strapped across their backs. The townspeople locked their doors. The children were kept inside the schoolhouse. And at the center of the town, Jacob Rusk climbed down from his horse. Beside him stood 5 armed men. Rusk looked toward the schoolhouse. Elias. His voice echoed through the cold morning air. Elias stepped outside. He wore the same brown coat he had worn every day since arriving in Red Hollow. His hands were empty. Rusk laughed. You really are a fool. Elias said nothing. Rusk pointed toward the schoolhouse. Come out here, and I'll leave the children alone. Elias looked behind him. 23 children stared back at him. Some were crying. Others were holding hands. Miss Hart stood at the front of the room. Elias slowly closed the door. Then he walked toward Rusk. But before he reached the center of the street, Clara stepped from behind the schoolhouse. Rusk's smile disappeared. Well, he said quietly. Look what the dead brought back. Clara stared at him. You should have left me dead. Rusk raised his pistol. Elias moved between them. It's over, Jacob. Rusk looked at him. No, Elias. He smiled. It's just beginning. Rusk drew his gun. Everything happened at once. A shot exploded. Elias fell. The children screamed. But the bullet had struck the wooden post beside him. Elias rolled behind a water barrel. The townspeople scattered. Rusk's men opened fire. Wood splintered from the schoolhouse walls. Windows shattered. Miss Hart pushed the children toward the back door. Run! One by one, the children escaped through the rear of the schoolhouse and disappeared into the dry creek bed. Elias watched from behind the barrel. He could see Rusk's men closing in. His heart pounded. Then he saw something lying in the dirt. His old revolver. Rusk had dug it up. The same weapon Elias had buried months earlier. Rusk kicked it toward him. Pick it up. Elias stared at the gun. For a moment, the entire world went silent. He could hear the children crying. He could hear Clara breathing behind him. He could hear the ghosts of 20 years ago. Then he heard another sound. A child's voice. Mr. Vane. Tommy. The boy was trapped inside the schoolhouse. A fire had started near the front door. Elias looked at the gun. Then at the schoolhouse. Then at the boy. He ran. Elias charged through the smoke. The roof creaked above him. Flames climbed the walls. He found Tommy beneath a fallen beam. The boy was terrified. I can't move. Elias grabbed the beam. Then I'll move it. He pulled. Nothing. He pulled again. The wood shifted. Elias screamed with effort. Finally, the beam rolled away. He lifted Tommy into his arms. Then the ceiling began to collapse. Elias ran. They burst through the back door just as part of the roof crashed behind them. Tommy was safe. But Elias fell to his knees. Clara rushed toward him. You're bleeding. Elias looked down. A bullet had torn through his shoulder. He smiled weakly. Still alive. Then a gunshot echoed. Clara turned. Jacob Rusk stood 20 yards away. His gun was pointed directly at Elias. But before Rusk could fire again, someone stepped from behind him. Miss Hart. She held a rifle. Drop it. Rusk turned. Too late. A dozen townsmen emerged from the buildings. They had finally decided to fight. Rusk looked around. For the first time, fear appeared in his eyes. Elias slowly stood. You see, Jacob? Rusk stared at him. Elias pointed toward the burning schoolhouse. You thought I was building a school to erase my past. He looked at the children gathered behind the townspeople. But I wasn't. Rusk's face twisted with anger. Then why? Elias looked at Clara. Because I wanted the next generation to have a chance to become better men than we were. Rusk raised his pistol. Clara fired first. The bullet struck Rusk's gun and knocked it from his hand. The townsmen rushed forward. Within seconds, Jacob Rusk was on his knees. Elias stood over him. Rusk looked up. Finish it. Elias stared at the man who had once controlled his entire life. Then he shook his head. No. Rusk laughed bitterly. You're afraid. Elias looked toward the buried revolver lying in the dirt. No. He turned away. I'm finally free. Jacob Rusk was taken to the county jail. And for the first time in 22 years, Elias Vane no longer had to look over his shoulder. But the schoolhouse was gone. Only blackened beams remained. The children stood in silence. Tommy looked at Elias. Are we going to build it again? Elias looked at the ashes. Then he looked at the children. Yes. This time, he wouldn't build it alone. The entire town helped. Farmers brought cedar. The blacksmith made nails. The women cooked meals. The children carried stones. And Clara stayed. Months later, the new schoolhouse opened. Above the door was a simple wooden sign. Red Hollow Schoolhouse. Elias became its caretaker. He never carried a gun again. He taught the children how to read. How to write. How to build. And most importantly, how to choose who they wanted to become. Years passed. The scars on Elias's hands faded. But the scars on his heart never did. One evening, an old Elias sat outside the schoolhouse as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Clara came and sat beside him. You know, she said, you never actually apologized. Elias looked at her. I know. Why? He stared at the horizon. Because some things are too terrible for an apology. Clara was silent. Then Elias continued. But I can spend the rest of my life proving I'm sorry. Clara looked at the schoolhouse. You did. Elias shook his head. No. He looked through the window. Inside, children were laughing. That's not me. He smiled. That's them. And perhaps that was the true redemption Elias Vane had spent his entire life searching for. Not forgiveness. Not forgetting. And not pretending the past had never happened. But accepting that some ghosts could never be buried. So instead of running from them, he built something strong enough to stand beside them. A schoolhouse. A future. And a place where children could learn the lesson Elias Vane had discovered far too late. A man's past may explain who he was. But it does not have to decide who he becomes.